way for people to start to unpack their understandings of migrant justice and start drawing those really important connections between migrant justice and climate justice. And so our whole group of panelists today are here to delve into different aspects of our understanding with migrant justice, how that relates to broader justice movements. And we're going to also talk about, of course, the ways that people can get involved and where you can tap in helpful and powerful ways so that we can build power and build momentum. So the way this is going to be set up is we're going to have each of the panelists are going to speak to a different aspect of the work that we're going to be unpacking today, from how work permits work for temporary foreign workers, farm workers, caregivers, and care workers, rather. And we're going to be talking about how displacement happens, because, of course, our understanding of climate impacts sometimes, especially in the environmental movement, are very misguided. We think that the only reason people are displaced are because of things like tsunamis and floods. And of course, it's much more complicated than that. And so we're going to talk about the ways people come to be displaced, the why people move or are on the move, the ways in which people are forced into situations of precarity, how you become undocumented, the means by which we force people into situations of being undocumented. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the legal framework in Canada and how that impacts people. And we're going to move into what we're going to do about it and how we're going to build power. And so after that, we're going to have room for Q&A. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little button that says Q&A. It'll give you the opportunity to submit questions to us, and you can ask questions of certain panelists. We're going to try and filter through those and make sure that we can stick within the time limit. But we're excited to get started. So thanks so much for joining. So to start off, we're going to be talking with Stacey Gomez. So Stacey's going to be talking about displacement and dispossession. I'll just give you an intro to her. Stacey Gomez is an organizer involved in Latin American solidarity, as well as struggles for migrant justice. She lives in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and we're going to hand it over to you. Stacey, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. So I am going to focus on the Central American caravans that I'm sure people have heard about, because I think that they're really emblematic of climate-induced displacement that we're already starting to see. When we talk about this, I think a lot of people think it's sometime in the future, but it's already happening. So the caravans have been referred to as refugee caravans, migrant caravans, or a Central American exodus because of the massive number of people that have been leaving. And most of the people are asylum seekers, and they're migrating as a life or death decision. So caravans came to worldwide attention in October and November 2018, and this was in large part to the targeting by Trump. And there have been several caravans since then, but media attention has dwindled since that time. So currently there is a caravan of 2,500 people that's in southern Mexico that it's making its way to the US-Mexico border. And there's been a bit of reporting around that. So the majority of people in the caravans are Honduran, and as well as a few other parts from Central America. And many of them are families. So Hondurans in particular are seeking to escape a situation of widespread violence, poverty, and government repression. And this has escalated since the 2009 coup. And this was backed by both the US and Canadian governments. So when I talk about this, I really do try to emphasize what are the Canadian connections to this issue, because it can seem like one that's removed from us. So since the 2009 coup, Honduras has become one of the most violent countries in the world, with high rates of murder, insecurity, and impunity. So what has been Canada's role? So Canada's role has included legitimizing the 2009 coup and also subsequent fraudulent elections that brought the current dictator, Juan Orlando Hernández, to power. And there have been ongoing demonstrations against him. It's been like the two years since his re-inauguration. And so there have been a lot of protests in the streets, ongoing violence against people who are protesting him. So Canada has played a role in funding security forces and investigative units to this repressive state, and also has backed foreign investment in sectors such as megatourism and mining, which are dispossessing people of their lands and livelihoods. And Canada also helped to rewrite the country's mining code. 90% of the companies in the country, mining companies, are Canadian. And it's a similar story in Guatemala. And I'm sure people have heard about the active role that Canada plays in the mining sector. So communities are still feeling the impacts, for instance, of Goldcorp's open pit mine in the Syria Valley, which closed in 2009. So this includes health impacts, environmental impacts, and impacts on the social fabric of the community. So an estimated 75% of mining companies are Canadian. And so for that reason, it's important to establish mechanisms that will actually ensure corporate accountability. Right now, that doesn't really exist. And I also wanted to talk about, in terms of how is climate change an underlying factor, acting as a push factor, forcing people to migrate. So climate change is impacting agriculture in Central America. So agriculture accounts for 1/3 of all employment in Central America, and many people are also subsistence farmers, and we see climate instability threatening food security in the region. So the dry corridor of Central America, this includes parts of Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. And it's been hit by extreme drought since 2014, and this is punctuated by flooding rains. So this means that crops are failing, and an estimated 2 to 3 million people have struggled to feed themselves. There are reports of children who have starved to death as well. So this is when when there are reports of people being asked why they're in the caravan, people are saying it's a life or death situation, not being able to feed themselves. That's one of the things that people are mentioning. And we've seen one of the areas around Western Honduras, which is a coffee producing area. So they're feeling really impacted. So when crops fail, rural residents move to urban areas. And they do this searching for work. But there they face a new set of challenges, such as threats and extortion by gangs. So a lot of people do cite violence and threats by gangs as one of the reasons why they're leaving. But as I mentioned, climate change, that is linked to climate change. And so that's when people are forced to migrate out of the country. So we are bound to continue to see massive flows of people on the move. And we have seen, I think this is the third massive wave of the migrant caravan, but they're not just 3 caravans. Each wave has multiple caravans of thousands of people. And it's hard to even estimate how many people. In late January, it was 15,000 people were issued a 1-year humanitarian visa by Mexico, and that was a very limited policy. So that's like one snapshot into that specific instance of how many people were migrating. And estimated that 150 million to 300 million climate refugees will be displaced worldwide by 2050. And so these are, yes, that's specific. So that's worldwide. But in terms of Central America, the estimates are 3.9 million people in Central America and Mexico over the next 30 years. And so, yes, it's unless we address these push factors, people are going to continue to be forced to leave their homes. So to date, the Canadian government has been silent on the caravans, and it's continued to ignore calls to end the Safe Third Country Agreement with the US. So the agreement closes the door to refugee claimants at the US-Canada border, limiting the number of refugees asylum seekers who can seek Canada's protection, with the exception of people who cross irregularly, forcing asylum seekers to cross in often dangerous conditions. So I have a few asks related to this work, but I don't know if now is the best time or later on.
I would say go for it, Stacey.
Okay, sounds good. So recognizing the role that Canada has played in creating push factors for people to leave their homes in these caravans, we think it is important for Canada to open its borders to these refugees and migrants. To date, there has not been that openness. And it's interesting because even like Lloyd Axworthy, like, you know, a white male politician, used to be, I think he was a minister, and he even called for Canada to accept refugees from the caravans, but like there hasn't really been a meaningful response to that. Also, ending the Safe Third Country Agreement, recognizing that the US isn't a safe country. That didn't start with Trump. Certainly there's a lot of issues that are being exacerbated there. Also, repressive regimes is important. And ending Canadian support for corporations that cause harm and forced displacement. Right now, there's also a push for a Canadian ombudsperson for the, it's called Core Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise. That includes the extractive sectors. So the Canadian government made a commitment to doing this actually before it was elected. Then 1 year in, it committed to doing this. Rather, 1 year ago, it committed to actually putting this forward, but it's still not in place. And also there's a lot of concern that what will be put forward is not going to be something that's effective for people to have remedy if they've been impacted by Canadian extractive companies. So these are a few asks. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacey. So Stacey's drawing some important connections, and for a couple of folks who I know just joined us, we've started with Stacey, who's talking about displacement, mostly across Central and South America, but also globally as well. And we're touching a little bit on, and Stacey did so well, on the ways in which the Canadian state actually forces people to move through Canadian mining practices abroad, mining profiteering that poisons communities, forces people from their homes, and the political destabilization that follows because of that, and how we actually need to recognize that as well as part of the climate crisis, the ways in which we are forcing people to move, push factors from people's homes. We're going to come back to everybody, so everyone will get a chance to speak again and dig deeper into it. So the next stage of the conversation we're going to go into is kind of that last point that you were touching on, Stacey, when you were talking about the Safe Third Country Agreement, the policies we have in place in Canada that criminalize people who are on the move, that block people from getting entrance to safety, to dignity, being able to process their claims and claim status. And so for that, we're actually going to go to Macdonald Scott. So Mac is going to talk a little bit about immigration streams, maybe a little bit of case studies, and we'll talk a little bit about the struggles with detentions. So Macdonald Scott is an immigration consultant, a longtime activist with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, and an organizer with No One is Illegal Toronto. Thanks for joining.
No worries. And actually, I cut my teeth on activism doing environmental justice work on the west coast of Canada with groups like Western Canada Wilderness Committee and other groups, Sierra Club, Sierra Legal Defense. So I think the first thing to come to, and I think Stacey touched on this, is that our immigration policies are by and large based on race, sexuality, disability, and primarily on keeping out poor and working class people from the global south. So brown and black people from the global south. And I won't go into the history because I wasn't asked to do that, but if you look at the history of Canada immigration policy, race has been woven throughout it and is still currently woven quite deeply into our immigration policies. So I'm going to go over briefly streams by which people can come here or stay here. And there's temporary streams and there's permanent streams. There are basically three main streams in temporary, which is worker, student, or visitor. There's some other less used streams such as the temporary resident permit, but I don't know if we need to get into the nitty-gritty of all this. The workers mainly have to come with what's called a labor market impact assessment. And what that means is the employer needs to pay $1,000 and show that they can't find a Canadian or a permanent resident that would fill the job. There's also a number of what they call international experience class, where they have we have treaties with different countries. There's also some working class programs, such as the caregiver and the seasonal agricultural worker abroad program. The big thing to keep in this in mind, and I mean, Hassan will talk to this more than me because this is what he does, is that by and large, these workers, especially if they're in working class jobs, are in an extremely marginal situation. If they lose their job, if they unionize at work and the employer lays them off or fires them, they lose their work permit, they're deported. Then we have students. Students come here to be, when they're accepted to an institution, after they prove that they can pay the largely excessive foreign student fees. And this is like the sort of stream of choice right now of the current government and the previous conservative government. And what it does is it puts a lot of money into the hands of Canadian universities, Canada in general. And then at the end of the day, they may or may not be eligible for and get permanent residency. And then we have visitors. And the only thing I would say about that is that if you're coming from the global south, many of the countries, in fact, that Stacey's talking about, there's no way in heck, unless you're really, really well off, that you're going to get a visitor visa to come to Canada. The turn down rate in Mexico City and Guatemala City, which are the consulates to deal with pretty much all the countries that Stacey's talking about that have done the caravans, tried to come, they just don't issue visas. Europe's a different story. You don't even need a visa. In permanent residency, there's three major streams. There's the economic stream, the family stream, and the refugee or humanitarian stream. The economic stream is largely now through the express entry with a small class for self-employed. And just for you, those of you who do agriculture, environmental work, they've gotten rid of the farmers. Farmers are not coming to Canada anymore. The express entry is largely based on, well, it's basically based on race and class. Your ability to speak English, what part of the world you're from, whether you are middle class or upper class, how much university education you have, whether you have people already in Canada. It's an extremely class and race-based program. And it's largely online right now. It's a lot quicker, but it really excludes the bulk of the working people. People who, if they've been white, farmers, workers, poor people. Then there's a small self-employed class for people with doing cultural work or athletics. The family class basically is based on a European model of family. It was expanded in the 80s to include a more open idea of family based on what many of the cultures in the world have, where family is not just your partner, your children, your parents, and now it's gone back to the old model. It's basically parents and grandparents are very difficult to bring, and I can go into more detail on that, but just, it's very difficult. The only people you can really bring are your partner and your children. And even then, you can't be on welfare. They can't be disabled or going to cost the Canadian medical system problems. And there's a bunch of other reasons why people are excluded based on race and class and disability. Then finally, we have this little drop in the bucket refugee and humanitarian class. And this is the one that Justin Trudeau likes to speak about, that we like to boast about when we bring like one person and put them on TV from Egypt. And Canada takes a drop, and they've waited 5-6 years in camps in horrid situations in Jordan, in Egypt, all over the world, waiting to come here as refugees, even though they have family here. And then there's the inland refugee process, which also is known to be very biased. There's been numerous articles in the Toronto Star and other papers about how arbitrary that system is. But I want to get into some case studies, and I got some that I thought might be interesting. My one sort of key refugee case I wanted to talk about was my first environmental refugee that I ever had, which was a Japanese woman from Japan during the 2011 earthquakes, who came to Canada basically because, as we all know, with the incidents with the nuclear reactors, that Japan was an extraordinarily unsafe place to live. Well, you know, there's a lot of hysteria out there about people coming here because of climate change, which largely has been created by Canadian, American, and European companies. But she was basically told there's no way you can do a refugee claim and send right back to Japan. And then, you know, we have the cases like what Stacey was talking about, where we have people who are actively coming to Canada because of from Africa with Canadian mining companies. We have a lot of refugees who come because of destabilization, whether environmental or war or economic. And I mean, you could do a whole seminar on how, and I'm sure many of you are aware, how unequal our economic system is between the North and South in this world. But we create the situations, people come, and then we target them as having jumped the queue and that it's their fault for being here in the first place. In my firm, the majority of our cases are women survivors of abuse. We have a lot of Mexican cases that come because of risk and because of poverty. We have a lot of LGBTQ refugees, people coming because they're being persecuted for their sexuality or gender identity. We have a lot of African refugee cases, and we have a lot of poor people. Now, and I just want to touch on that briefly. When I talked a bit about my grandparents came as 4 farmers from Scotland, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 generations ago. And at that point, Canada was welcoming in people because they were coming, and to be honest, because they're white. We still have poor and working people who want to move to Canada to try and make a better life for their families. But the difference is that now they're brown, they're black. And so what we've done is we've created immigration policies to make sure that those people don't get here at all. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about detentions. Is my time okay? Yeah. So a little bit about detentions. And I've worked a lot on trying to stop immigration detention. I've been fortunate enough to be part of that struggle for about 15 years. And what I like to think about that struggle is that it's the timeline of a struggle that has largely won. So in 2013, just getting into the more recent part of the struggle, 191 people went on hunger strike in the largest migrant hunger strike in Canadian history at the Central East Correctional Centre in Lindsay, Ontario. It's a lovely little Central Ontario town with a waterfall and a big soup premier. This continued with strikes on their court hearings called detention reviews, more hunger strikes. Cases went into the courts. We had a case called Chowdhury, where they finally recognized the rights of migrant detainees to use habeas corpus, the old ancient produce the body legal remedy to challenge their detentions. In 2014, the End Immigration Detention Network released the Truth About Immigration Detention report, which exposed the arbitrary nature and the racist nature of the detention system. Then in 2017, we had the Brown case, went to the Federal Court of Canada, and as a result, they produced a bunch of reports. They did an audit which recommended huge changes in the detention system. And last fall, we actually had our first Supreme Court case called China, which was around, again, the habeas corpus. What's come out of this, we haven't won. They're still detaining people. And they are, all my clients who are detained are mostly black and the others are brown. But what we've won is that there now is such a spotlight on that detention system that they are detaining perhaps 1/10 of what they used to detain. I had clients who are being held 10, 12 years. That's almost unheard of now. And this is due to the organizing that people did on the inside, which brings me around to my conclusion. We can win. We have a lot of the detention, even under the Harper government, a conservative government that hated migrants more than, well, actually there's been lots of governments that hate migrants, but one of the ones that really hated migrants. We can win. And I think what it comes down to me is not just the connections on the issues between climate justice and migrant justice, but that we're stronger together. They are more united on these issues than they have ever been. When they, as you all know, when they did the yellow vests across Canada, they were talking anti-racist xenophobia crap all the way across, as well as supporting pipelines that will lead my grandchildren into despair. So what we're seeing is they're united. We need to become united because together we can fight, and regardless of who gets in power in the fall, we can fight and we can win. And so I look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mac. I mean, Mac touched on so many important points. And I'm just going to encourage everyone again to be thinking about the questions you would like to ask panelists, so that you have them prepared when we go to the questions section. Mac, you touched on a lot of like really important things that we're going to tease out later as well, but I really like how you're underscoring again, and just like Stacey is, that immigration system to become undocumented, the ways in which we force people to become precarious, and the ways that we're criminalizing some migrants and refugees over others is racist. It's racism. That's what's driving a huge part of this. And racism will be a massive part of the federal election. Regardless of who gets into power, we need to mobilize an intersectional movement that way transcends how we talk about race, because racism and addressing racism, anti-racist work has to be a core value and foundational building block of the climate movement. And that's what we're going to tease out a little bit further now. So we're going to, our next speaker is Karen. So Karen is an organizer. Karen Cocq is a organizer with the Workers' Action Center and Fight for 15 and Fairness. She's based in Ottawa. She's active in local efforts to build a broad-based fight back against the Ford government, and has been active in migrant justice, anti-poverty, and labor struggles for almost 2 decades. Thanks for joining us, Karen.
Thanks for having me. And I'm happy to see such nice friendly faces on the other side of my screen. There was a bunch of stuff that I was going to touch on that I feel like Stacey and Mac have really laid the groundwork for, so I think it's actually a nice progression. But I'm hoping that one of the takeaways that folks are able to sort of grasp already is, and I think which is what sort of the central point of what I was going to say, is that we need to be thinking about, when we're talking about climate change, when we're talking about climate justice and climate justice work, we're thinking about the structural links between climate change and those links. But if we are making the link between climate justice and the economic system and the problems with the economic system, then that means that we are necessarily talking about racism and immigration, and we are talking about workers and labor. Those things are like inextricable. And so, at one level, which folks have already talked about, like that I think is a bit, that is sort of the very sort of the frontline sort of level that is really clear, I think, for us now. So things like how climate crises are producing displacement. And so like Stacey talked about that, and Matt has said some things about that. Floods in the Philippines, which is where predominantly most care workers that come to Canada come from, and the impact that has on the why people migrate and the kind of work that people are doing in countries like Canada in order to be able to support families at home, that there are no job opportunities in places where people are coming from, and that climate crisis, it exacerbates economic disparities and economic crises that then force people to migrate. We were talking earlier about the typhoons in Dominica last year, where a bunch of migrant workers were no longer able to go back home, but also meant that they weren't able to get other work permits here in Canada, and so become undocumented. And that is, so there are very direct links that we see, obviously, around how climate change and climate crises are producing displacement. But there's other levels to it, I think, that are a little bit more complex, and that I think really like enrich, or have the capacity to enrich our understanding of the connections between our various movements, that will be able to make us a lot stronger. So if we look at, for example, the tar sands in Canada, so we know a lot we're talking from is having on the global climate crisis. But then if we think about migrant workers who are working in the tar sands on tied permits, with restrictions around the rights that they have access to healthcare, access to other basic services, labor mobility that they don't have, and what that does for putting migrant workers in situations where they are unable to exercise rights that they technically have on paper, but that in reality, because of the intersection between their working conditions and their immigration status, are unable to exercise without fear of losing their jobs, therefore losing their work permits, therefore losing their status, therefore being deported. And like in very extreme examples, for example, where there's 3 Chinese migrant workers who died in the tar sands recently, like these are very real examples, concretely, locally in so-called Canada, where we see the intersections between these things. But it goes even beyond that. So we've been sort of recently having conversations about, a Green New Deal. What would a Green New Deal look like for Canada, coming out of some of the momentum that has been coming in the US? And, we hear a lot of folks talking about what is a just transition, right? And what does a just transition look like? And a lot of folks talking about how do we manage an economic transition in the context of a climate crisis for people who are working in extractive sectors, in like high carbon jobs, et cetera. And I guess the point that I want to make, and kind of the perspective that I kind of bring from the kinds of organizing that we do with folks who are working in low wage and precarious jobs, is that one thing is the just transition for sort of like oil patch workers and thinking about that. And another thing is thinking about what does a climate, like a just transition in terms of the climate, mean for actually existing workers in actually existing low wage, precarious, shitty jobs. That is a crisis that we have across this country. Of people who are working under terrible working conditions with very few rights and for very low wages, which means that we are talking about workers who are primarily racialized and workers who are primarily women. And those are a lot of that work is in sort of quote unquote like low carbon sectors, right? So we are talking about retail, food service and accommodation, service sector, and the care economy. And so the caring economy with the migrant justice piece is an interesting kind of intersection that I think reveals a lot of the connections between these things. So, we have a program of temporary labor mobility for care workers who are predominantly racialized women who come to Canada under extremely oppressive working conditions, that their status is tied to their working conditions, tied to their employers, who are providing the reproductive social labor that allows a lot of other people to be able to work, raise their families, take care of their sick and elderly. And that is service work, that is care work. Care work is, I don't want to really kind of reify the term, but care work is sort of low carbon work. And what does it say about our understanding of what climate justice is if we are not centering the realities of people and rethinking who is a climate worker? Right? Like, who are people who do climate work? And that includes people who may not describe themselves as people who do climate work, but who are doing the kind of work that keeps our societies functioning and together, and that there is no coincidence that that is the work that is undervalued and underpaid, and that those jobs are highly exploitative, and that they are primarily done by racialized folks and primarily done by women. And so when we're talking about a just transition, how do we think about those kinds of things? And how do we think about the really concrete, real-time, immediate interventions that we need in order to make the lives of those folks and of those workers more dignified and better, so that they can support their families and support themselves? And also, which I guess is the flip of it, is sort of rethinking who does climate work in a very, very broad sense. But also thinking, like, where does change come from? And I feel like we hear a lot about how, we obviously need to center migrants because they are at the forefront of like affected communities. And I think that's we need to broaden our understanding of what we're actually talking about, because migrants, racialized folks, are not just at the forefront of affected communities of climate change. Migrant workers and racialized workers are not just at the forefront of affected communities. The knowledge and the strategies and the deep understanding, like Stacey was talking about with the agricultural crisis in Central America, like the deep understanding of what climate change really means socially for us, comes not just from people who are at the forefront of experiencing that crisis, but at the people who are at the forefront of coming up with the solutions. Those are the places where our solutions are going to come from. And so we can't just think about migrants as sort of being at the forefront of impacted communities, but like understanding who are the agents of change actually, and where is our power actually. And that is in a highly racialized, highly gendered, low wage, immigrant, working class part of this country that is organizing and is doing work, and they are organizing around their labor rights. They are organizing around gender justice. They are organizing around migrant justice. And if we aren't able to understand that all of that work as climate justice work. We are missing massive opportunities to connect, to build links between our movements, to build our power, and also to understand that those are the folks who are going to give us the solutions that we need, that are innovative, that are the things that we haven't thought about, where the power is. And our task, I think, is to understand really where power for change comes from, and how workers, which means racialized, gendered workers, migrant workers, need to be at the forefront of what a climate solution is, because fundamentally rethinking how our economic system functions and the climate crises that the current capitalist system is producing means taking our lead in our direction from the folks who are the ones who labor in that system and experience the brunt of the impacts of it. And if we fail to do that, I think that we are opening up a massive opportunity for the right to intervene on those questions, right? So we all know that there is a massive increase in xenophobic language and discourse and sentiment. There are, like far right groups are multiplying and organizing across this country. And that, I think, presents a strategic challenge and an urgent, immediate moment for us to intervene on, to say that if we get these connections between labor justice and migrant justice and climate justice and gender justice right, and underscored and led by a fight for Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, understanding how we do all of this work in a settler colonial context and on stolen land. If we get those connections right, we have the possibility to massively multiply our power, our resources, and our people. And that's where our power is going to come from if we're really going to defeat this resurgent right, if we're going to defeat this racist xenophobic agenda, if we're going to defeat climate crisis economy that is driving us to destruction. Our power is in those connections, and our power is in being able to center the people who are at the forefront of knowing how we are really going to overcome this and understanding how the system fundamentally works.
Thank you, Karen. I'm not even going to try and summarize that. I think you landed on the exact point that we want to touch on. Oh, we're joined by Hassan at the Progress Summit, I see. So I think we're gonna just for time's sake, because we have about 15 more minutes or so, we're gonna move right into our last speaker, Hassan. So Hassan is a migrant justice organizer and campaigner with both the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change and the Migrant Rights Network, and is an anti-racist community organizer in Toronto. Hassan is going to talk to us a little bit about building power and what needs to happen next.
Thank you so much, and hi everyone. I'm speaking to you from unceded Algonquin territory, but as Maya mentioned, I'm actually based in Toronto, which is the territories of the Wendat and Shtami people, as well as the Mississauga River. And for us, of course, this acknowledgement is not simply about claiming, doing something moral or symbolic, but rather to say that our work, I'm going to be louder, that our work is primarily as migrants is about being in solidarity with Indigenous struggles for self-determination. Now, we have heard some extremely compelling reasons for how migrants, refugees, and documented people, racialized people, are at the front line of crisis and at the forefront of change. And Mac and Stacey and Karen have really sort of painted a really important connection between the ways in which capitalism, colonization, environmental and other forms of displacement have come together to create this particular moment of climate. To that is activists and organizers. I assume that everyone on this call here, like me, wakes up every day thinking we've got 11 years to turn the ship around. Not just that we have 11 years, but we know that we have 11 years to have completed the process of turning the ship around. So we've actually a lot less than 11 years. And in this moment, we start feeling like, we just need to focus on the key issues, right? We need to focus on fossil fuels. We need to focus on carbon emissions. We need to reel in some of these, the worst offenders, because this is about an existential crisis. We live and die on these decisions. And I want to say that you're not entirely wrong, right? But the people who are the most committed against that particular need for us to take significant and compelling action on climate crisis is a growing global right-wing populist, nativist, xenophobic, racist grouping. And that grouping, whether it's Trump, whether it's Bolsonaro, whether it's Modi, whether it's Netanyahu, these people have come into power through a politics of division. And in the North, in North America and Europe, that politics of division will primarily be about racism and against hatred for foreigners. So I'm saying to you, as campaigners, as activists, as people who care about the environment, even if you don't have, morally are inclined to support refugees and migrants, which I think you should be, but if you're not, then act with very specific anti-racist measures. This year, right now, we will be gaining power. Alberta, right now with Jason Kenney, whether that was in Quebec with CAQ coming into power, whether that's in Ontario with Doug Ford. When we fail to take on divisiveness and racism and xenophobia as well, we'll have the right to win. So now is the moment. So it is with this team, migrants, refugees, what are we going to do? And we formed at the end of last year a national network called the Migrant Rights Network. So it's migrantrights.ca. You can go there, you can join right now. And what the Migrant Rights Network proposes is simply 3 types of actions. 1, massive popular education against racism and xenophobia. We're not talking about comprehensively going into classrooms, workplaces, community centers, activist groups, and doing workshops and trainings against, because this populist nativist push is happening at all levels, and people need to know the facts and be trained to push back against them. So I invite you to sign up onto the website for training, but there's also materials you can download. So almost every 6 to 8 weeks, we've pulled a day of action. There's March 21st, that was just last week, where we did these actions in over a dozen cities. The next one is May 1st, then June 16th, and then September 2nd. And people, so you are each invited to either take on an action or join an action in your community, so that we can be taking up public space to say, look, all our struggles are connected. We oppose racism and xenophobia, and we want this global social justice vision. And finally, we're trying to create a platform for, zero fossil fuels, right? Will of course include action on climate change. Because we know that's what our communities need in the lead up to the federal election. And we need to show and make sure that we've got that kind of environmental justice activists and organizers in the country to take on the fight against racism and xenophobia. Thought of up as this rallying cry for action on climate change. Again, existential moment, we need to act. But what we need to be very clear about, the Green New Deal cannot be a moment where we say we want to clean house here while displacing these rich companies, these oil oligarchy, these exploratory companies, these massively climate destructive organizations to just say, okay, sure, we'll stop fossil fuels here, but we'll go and do it in Jamaica, or we'll go and do it further in other parts of the world. We'll go and support a coup in Venezuela so we can move our production there. So we need to have a global approach to the conversation on Green New Deal, which is going to be coming from everywhere. So that's all I'm going to say. I know we have time limited, so hopefully we can get some questions. And again, the website is migrantrights.ca. Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan. So recognizing we have about 10 minutes, I'm gonna just move right into questions. I know we have a couple already. Just touched upon. But the first question we have is, folks are wondering a little bit more. I think there was some people were wondering, is this just strictly, can we tease out what this looks like on a global scale? And there's a lot of questions about the Green New Deal and what type of language needs to be included in it to expand this frame in a meaningful way. Is it too late to do that? What are the most effective ways we can expand the language of a Green New Deal to include migrant justice at its core? And what do you recommend for people to get? Anybody can respond.
So maybe I would just say quickly around Green New Deal questions. I think that I just want to say, I think it's very exciting that people got a solution around a just society look like, and so how do we incorporate things necessarily are part of a solution. So I think that that's great. I do think that, and as conversations that we've had with a lot of folks in the last little while, is that I think that and partly because of the and laws and elections as the sort of like things that we have at our disposal to change stuff and to make things happen. And those are important tools, I think, in a longer term and broader strategy for social change. But I think that we can fall back on just those in their own right, and forget that those are only as good as the movements and the people who are going to make them real, hold them to account, and then organize beyond them. So I think that we can talk about how we center a politic of migrant justice in Green New Deal conversations, and at the same time be careful that we are not falling into a sort of exercise around like wordsmithing of like the perfect policy prescriptions and the perfect kind of statements or these kinds of things, because fundamentally the best, I think, which is what I was saying before, the best and the most innovative ideas are going to come out of the people who are doing the organizing on the ground in communities that are the most affected by these overlapping systems. And the only usefulness of a frame and the sort of policy ideas and all of that is in the service of the organizing that those communities are doing. And as a unifying frame to help bring those struggles together and then build them and amplify them and grow them. And so I think that we need to understand sort of policy ideas as tools in a toolkit, insofar as they serve to build our capacity to organize for the kinds of change that we want.
There's a lot of questions. I'm not sure which one to respond to. So maybe I'll try and respond to a few very quickly. So there was a question here about the large increase in the federal budget for border security. Approximately 60% of that money is actually going to refugee processing. So the bigger worry is that the government's trying to show that it's strong on the border, which looks like the Liberals are trying to also show that they're just as racist as the Conservatives. Of course, 40% increase in the budget is a big problem that we need to really deal with. Now, there's other questions. So are there immigrant workers in the tar sands? Yes, there have been a number of temporary foreign workers and, of course, immigrant workers in the tar sands. Those numbers keep changing. There's a question about migrant worker conditions and unionization. Absolutely, unionizing would help. But, for example, all agricultural workers are exempt from unionization. Not just in a number of provinces. Domestic workers, because it's one employer, one employee, again, unionization is not possible. So we have to come up with innovative new methods. So, for example, sectoral bargaining, and we need to make agricultural unionization a priority. That's definitely something that we are looking at in great detail. So those are just some responses. But really, I think the question is, how do we build power A lot of the environmental movement and even our own movements have been about symbolic power, which is to say we sign petitions, we take to the streets once a year, and we try to shame the government into taking action. When there's direct action, it's just a few people trying to block a single pipeline for a few days. We are trying to change everything. We are trying to save humanity, right? It is not going to be given to us by some really gentle, soft approach. It is going to happen when we are actually exercising power where we have power the most. And the places we have power the most are our schools and our workplaces, right? We need to say that, like, it is going to cost because the economy is a single unit. Once it becomes costly at all points, whether you are working as a retail worker, whether you are working in a factory, that's where it happens. So we need to actually stop the flow of capital at all points in an organized fashion, which means we have to all be going to regular meetings and be trained. That's what it's going to take to save us, not us, because we're at the top of the mountain, we'll be fine, but save most of the planet from the climate catastrophe.
I just wanted to
Thank
speak.
you, Hassan.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Mac.
To Prisna and Jerry, about they brought up something really amazing about how the fact is that we have to fight capitalism, which I think is what Hassan's saying, and that if you want to find one set of policies that bring all the issues together, Canadian immigration policies do. They manifest sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, classism, racism, all throughout. And I think that's one of the beautiful things both about environmental justice and migrant justice is that they bring many of the issues together. And I was just going to say, in terms of places to organize, I think doing the organizing you're already doing, but doing it in a way that builds relationships with migrant justice groups is what I think is really a way to bring, to bring things forward.
Thank you, Mac. I'm just going to ask Stacey if there's any final remarks you'd like to share with folks.
Nope, that's good. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, well, we're just about at time on the dot. Thank you, all of you, for speaking on these issues. I think the thread that we're picking up here for folks who have stayed with us this entire time is that these struggles are very, very connected. If you believe in anti-capitalism, if you believe in addressing the climate crisis head on, we have to be talking about workers' rights. We have to be talking about open borders. We have to be talking about treating people with dignity and respect wherever they're coming from. And that everybody should have status and access to resources and access to essential services. If your climate work has never included migrant justice before, if you thought racism was separate from climate justice work, we're encouraging you to talk to your racist colleagues, talk to your racist uncles, have those difficult conversations, and show up in solidarity with the actions that are going to be happening coast to coast, not only with the Migrant Rights Network, which I think, Hassan, we've shared the address, migrantrightsnetwork.ca. And for folks who want to tap into when those actions are, if you want to host an action in your city, we're encouraging you to get involved. You're going to correct the website?
Migrantrights.ca.
No,
I said it's migrantrights.ca, so not the
migrantrights.ca.
And Hassan, do you want to just mention the upcoming dates?
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, just one more time.
Can you mention the upcoming dates again?
The upcoming dates are, the next one is May Day. So May 1st, and then June 16th, and then September 2nd.
We'll see you all on the streets.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mac. Thank you, Stacey. Thank you, Hassan and Karen, for joining us. And thank you, everybody who tuned in to follow this webinar with The Leap. We're going to be producing more content on the links between migrant justice and climate justice. You can visit it on our website. We have a podcast out on it. We have educational materials coming out. And we'll be posting regularly about actions that you can join from coast to coast to engage with the Migrant Rights Network Days of Action and other days of action in your cities. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.